Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. At 6:19 a.m. on January 29th, 2024, officers from the San Antonio Police Department arrived at Oak Creek Apartments off Vance Jackson Road. The dispatch report flagged the scene as disturbance with unknown injuries. But what they walked into was something else entirely. In front of Building 3, a man stood pacing barefoot, soaked in blood from chest to knees. His hands trembled. His speech was incoherent. Inside apartment 307, the body of a 51-year-old woman named Sheila-Jo Hanks Portillo lay in the living room. She had a single gunshot wound to the head. There were no signs of forced entry. The door wasn't broken, windows intact. No signs of a break-in, and yet, she was dead. A black 9mm handgun rested on the tile floor near her body. Officers secured the scene. EMS declared the woman deceased at 6:26 a.m. The male outside, later confirmed to be Carlos Portillo, the victim's husband, was immediately detained. His clothes were heavily saturated with what appeared to be blood. He kept repeating, "She's gone. She's gone. I didn't mean. I." Officers reported erratic behavior. He smelled of alcohol. His pupils were dilated. He had no visible injuries that would justify that amount of blood. At this point, the officers couldn't determine whether they were dealing with a homicide, suicide, or domestic disturbance turned deadly. Protocol required that he be separated and searched. During that pat-down, they located a small bag of crystalline substance tucked in his waistband, later tested and confirmed as methamphetamine. They didn't read him his rights, not yet. They didn't have to. He wasn't under arrest at that moment. He was being detained pending investigation. But his words were already raising flags. The apartment itself was in partial disarray. Not wrecked, but lived in. No shattered objects. No broken glass. A coffee mug was upright on the kitchen counter. Two dog bowls sat by the back door, untouched. Nothing screamed struggle. Nothing screamed chaos. But the blood, there was a lot of it. A forensics tech later noted that while the blood pool was centered beneath Sheila-Jo's head, secondary smears were found on the back of the couch and trailing faintly toward the front door. The pattern wasn't consistent with spatter from the single shot that ended her life, which suggested she may have been moved, or that someone moved around her. But there was no trail of exit, no boot prints, just sock impressions. Carlos's, matching the ones collected from his feet at the scene. The apartment was sealed. SAPD homicide was called in. By 8:13 a.m., detectives Salinas and Reeder arrived. Initial body temperature readings were consistent with time of death within the last 4 hours. No defensive wounds were visible. The wound was a close contact shot, left temple. Gunpowder residue would later be tested on both the decedent and the suspect. The medical examiner's team retrieved the body at 9:42 a.m. Before transport, a scene investigator documented fingernail scrapings, the position of the gun, and took high-res scans of the area surrounding the body. A small dog, a terrier mix, barked non-stop inside the bedroom. A second dog, reportedly older, cowered under the dining table. Both were secured by animal care services. One detective would later comment, "It wasn't just the way she died. It was how quiet the room felt after, like it had been building to this." Detectives canvassed the building. A neighbor in 308 reported hearing a pop sometime after 3 a.m., but dismissed it as a door slam. Another tenant in 311 said she heard someone crying between 5 and 6 a.m., but by the time she checked, the hallway was empty. No surveillance cameras faced the unit directly. However, the property had a motion-activated security cam near the entrance gate. It showed Carlos entering the complex around 10:47 p.m. the previous night. No footage showed him leaving. Inside the apartment, police recovered two phones. One belonged to Carlos, the other to Sheila-Jo. Both were locked. Their contents were to be submitted to digital forensics within 48 hours. But one detail stood out. Sheila-Jo's phone had a fingerprint sensor, and she hadn't been using it since January 28th at 10:32 p.m. Text logs showed a message sent to a contact saved as Lindy Work, reading, "Thanks for everything today. I think I'll be able to breathe soon." There was no follow-up. Detectives noted a drawer in the hallway was open. Inside, files related to veterinary appointments, bank statements, and what looked like a lease application for another apartment complex. Not Oak Creek. Date printed, January 25th. By the end of the day, the apartment was under full evidence lock. SAPD listed the case as suspicious death pending autopsy. But within the department, most already suspected what would come next. The morning after Sheila-Jo Hanks Portillo's body was found, SAPD's Victim Identification Unit began the standard background trace. By 9 a.m., her driver's license, criminal record, none, vehicle registration, employment file, and emergency contacts had all been pulled. Sheila-Jo was 51. No history of prior arrests, no active restraining orders, no open protective filings. She had been living at Oak Creek Apartments since 2019. Lease records showed consistent rent payments under her name. She worked part-time for a local community health outreach clinic, handling patient intake and scheduling. No HR flags, no reported conflicts. Her direct supervisor described her as low-key, polite, consistent. But there were discrepancies between how she was described at work and what neighbors claimed. Detectives canvassed units adjacent to 307. The resident in 305 said she'd noticed Sheila walking her dogs less often in recent weeks. The man 2 doors down mentioned that sometimes there was yelling, mostly from a male voice. No one had ever called police. There were no incident reports tied to the apartment since the couple moved in. Sheila-Jo's 2 dogs had been documented in the lease. 1 senior Labrador mix, 1 small terrier. Neighbors noted the dogs barked more frequently in the past month, especially at night. Again, nothing escalated to official complaint. Digital forensics took custody of Sheila-Jo's Samsung Galaxy S10. At 11:36 a.m., her fingerprint was used to unlock the device for data imaging under emergency warrant parameters. The phone showed no texts, calls, or app activity after 10:32 p.m. on January 28th. Investigators flagged 1 outgoing message to a contact labeled Lindy Work, time-stamped 10:27 p.m. It read, "Thanks again. I think I'll be able to sleep tonight. Trying to stay calm." Detectives noted the phrasing. It suggested recent stress, but not panic. Calm, measured. Someone trying to manage a situation. Call logs over the previous 10 days included regular calls to a leasing office unrelated to her current apartment complex. Cross-referencing revealed it was Ridge Hollow Apartments, a different housing complex across town. On January 25th, she had submitted a rental inquiry via the property's website. On January 26th, she'd scheduled an in-person tour. That meeting, according to Ridge Hollow staff, did occur. She came alone, asked detailed questions about pet fees, move-in dates, and early lease terminations. She never submitted a full application. Her checking account, pulled via subpoena, showed a withdrawal of $720 on January 27th. No corresponding purchase was logged. That money wasn't found in the apartment or on her person. Investigators believed she may have been preparing to leave. In towns like San Antonio, people often disappear quietly from relationships. They don't make headlines. They don't leave trails. But Sheila-Jo had left one. Subtle, deliberate, private. In the apartment, officers recovered a single drawer of documents: vet records, expired prescriptions, an unpaid dental invoice, a flyer for a women's counseling service. No note, no journal, no overt signs of distress, but the layout of the drawer told a different story. The vet records were stacked neatly. The other items, the personal ones, were folded inside a manila folder labeled Spring Plan. Detectives flagged the folder for latent prints and possible secondary DNA. No third-party fingerprints were found on it, but it was clear she had been organizing something. A next step. At 1:02 p.m., SAPD's Criminal Investigations Division, CID, requested background on Carlos Portillo. His record came back flagged. 5 arrests between 1998 and 2010. Charges included resisting arrest, unauthorized use of a motor vehicle, and burglary of habitation. He had served time on at least 2 of those counts. No current warrants. His probation had ended in 2016. Since then, nothing. Until now. There was no marriage certificate on file in Bezar County under Sheila Hanks or Sheila Portillo. Investigators were unsure whether the 2 were legally married or cohabitating under common law. This raised questions about shared property, financial control, and legal consent. According to leasing records, Carlos was not an official occupant of the apartment, yet neighbors confirmed he had been living there consistently since at least early 2023. There were no signed complaints against him, no formal reports, but SAPD's domestic violence unit confirmed that lack of documentation did not equal safety. People assume if someone's in trouble, there'll be a paper trail. That's not always the case, one investigator noted. And in Sheila-Jo's case, the paper trail was thin, but it was there, just not where people usually look. At 3:40 p.m., officers returned to the apartment with a second scene review order. They collected the manila folder, two torn dog bed liners from the living room, and a sealed envelope addressed to me, which was empty. Again, no note. But its presence was unusual. Later analysis of the folder would yield one partial sentence written on the inner flap, visible only under oblique light. Yet it can't be scared forever. No signature, no date, no recipient. What stood out to investigators wasn't just the forensics, but the pattern. Sheila-Jo had not been acting recklessly. She'd been planning, carefully, quietly, but something had cut her off before she could finish. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. By noon on January 30th, 2024, the case file for Sheila-Jo Hanks Portillo was no longer categorized as a suspicious death. The classification was changed to active homicide. The adjustment was procedural, but within SAPD's Criminal Investigations Division, the shift also signaled the start of tighter scrutiny, especially on the man who had been standing barefoot in her blood. Detectives Salinas and Reeder submitted a request to unseal prior criminal records for Carlos Portillo. Within the hour, a 7-page criminal background report arrived from the Texas Department of Public Safety. Carlos had been in and out of custody from 1998 to 2010. Charges included possession of a controlled substance, unlawful entry, and resisting arrest. Notably, he had served a 4-year sentence for burglary of habitation, a second-degree felony in Texas. While there was no record of felony domestic violence charges, his name had appeared in 2 police dispatch logs in the early 2000s as subject involved in verbal altercation, though no arrests were made. His last documented contact with law enforcement had been in 2016, a traffic infraction in Bezier County. In the Oak Creek lease agreement, Carlos Portillo's name did not appear. That detail, combined with his lack of steady employment and undocumented residency, raised questions about his financial dependence on Sheila-Jo. When police searched the unit, they found no income records or tax returns bearing his name. The utilities were registered to Sheila-Jo. She was the sole signatory on the rent ledger. In practice, she was supporting the household alone. Toxicology results from the substance retrieved from Carlos's waistband were expedited through SAPD's narcotics lab. The 1.4 grams of crystalline powder tested positive for methamphetamine with a purity above 85%. That amount, while small, exceeded the threshold for simple possession under Texas law and qualified as possession of a penalty Group 1 substance, a felony charge. Carlos had been Mirandized at 10:08 a.m., the morning after Sheila-Jo's death. In a non-custodial interview, he claimed he had been sleeping when the shooting occurred. He said he awoke to find her unresponsive. He denied using drugs that night, but acknowledged prior recreational use. He claimed the gun belonged to him, but said he hadn't touched it in days. The forensic evidence began contradicting those statements. The 9mm Taurus semi-automatic handgun recovered at the scene was processed by ballistics. The serial number matched a legally purchased firearm registered in Carlos's name in 2021. The weapon was found approximately 14 inches from the right side of the victim's head. It was not holstered. There were no smudges or drag marks indicating it had fallen from a height. The weapon was lying flat, parallel to the baseboard, too precisely aligned for chance. Gunshot residue, GSR testing, was performed on both Carlos and Sheila-Jo. The tests used scanning electron microscopy and energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy. Sheila-Jo's results showed trace elements of barium on the dorsal side of her left hand, consistent with proximity to a fired weapon, but inconclusive for discharge. Carlos's right palm and inner fingers tested positive for all 3 primary GSR components: lead, antimony, and barium. According to lab technicians, the concentration was consistent with recent firing. More significantly, when crime scene techs examined the recoil marks on the victim's skull, they noted a slight downward trajectory to the entry wound. The bullet had entered at a downward angle from the left temple, traveling rightward and slightly backward. Forensic pathologists later confirmed this trajectory was unlikely to have been self-inflicted, especially for a right-handed victim. Sheila-Jo was confirmed right dominant based on handwriting samples and dental care records. The angle of fire raised red flags. So did the absence of gun oil or soot smudging on her hands. Investigators reanalyzed the position of the gun relative to her body. They noted that her fingertips showed no blood transfer or impressions consistent with contact after the wound occurred. However, the trigger bore a partial thumbprint, a match to Carlos's right hand. It was a latent print, lifted with magnetic powder and confirmed through AFIS scan by 3:26 p.m. When confronted with this during a follow-up interview on February 1st, Carlos paused, then claimed he picked up the gun afterward. He said he was trying to move it away from her. When asked why his print was on the trigger, he stated, "I don't know. I just grabbed it." SAPD investigators noted this as a significant deviation from his earlier account, and one that introduced direct contact with the weapon. The timeline became central. According to Ridge Hollow apartment staff, Sheila-Jo had scheduled a lease signing for February 2nd. That detail was confirmed by an internal calendar entry created from her Google account, which SAPD's Digital Forensics Unit accessed using an emergency preservation order. There were also 2 voicemails stored in her deleted folder, both left by Carlos in mid-January. One of them, dated January 14th, included the statement, "I don't know why you're acting like this. You think you're just gonna run off?" The second was more subdued, ending with, "I won't let you make a mistake." Neither recording included explicit threats, but investigators added both to the case file. While the apartment showed no signs of forced entry or external conflict, SAPD officers did find one small detail that hadn't been logged earlier. Tucked into a rolled towel under the bathroom sink was a second magazine, loaded with 6 rounds. The magazine matched the Taurus firearm model. Its presence indicated prior knowledge of the weapon's location and accessories, suggesting familiarity and routine handling. As investigators compiled their findings, a profile began to emerge, not of sudden chaos, not of unexpected violence, but of a slow-burning rupture marked by control, dependency, and increasing behavioral volatility. Carlos's statements were inconsistent. His prints were on the weapon. The GSR aligned. The trajectory ruled out suicide. And the timing, combined with Sheila-Jo's documented plan to leave, narrowed motive. What remained unclear, at least for now, was intent, and whether what happened was premeditated or the result of escalation. The data pointed one way, but it was still early. By February 2nd, 2024, investigators had access to the full contents of Sheila-Jo Hanks Portillo's cloud-linked devices. The data retrieved from her Gmail account, Drive, and synced calendar added clarity to a profile that, until now, was still missing context. Behind the neutral social media activity and minimal external complaints was a woman who had been preparing, not just emotionally, but logistically, to walk away from a situation that, in hindsight, had become untenable. Calendar entries suggested a discrete planning timeline. On January 14th, a notation was added. Ridge Hollow Tour, confirmed time. On the 25th, she updated that entry with a phone number and confirmation code. The last calendar note, entered on January 28th at 9:02 p.m., simply read, "Final box." Cross-referenced with the apartment search, officers located a small moving box in the bedroom closet labeled Docs plus Dog Meds. It contained 2 folders of veterinary records, a bottle of amoxicillin for her older dog, and a typed lease application dated January 26, unsigned. Digital records from her Gmail showed a message in drafts. Timestamped at 10:14 p.m. on January 28th, the unsent email was addressed to her supervisor, entitled Resignation. The message body was brief. "Thank you for everything. I appreciate the support. I've made the decision to move and focus on myself this year." She never hit send. The last verified communication she received came through a co-worker's text thread. supportive in tone, but not urgent. There were no threatening messages, no ultimatums, but digital behavior analysis indicated a shift. More Google searches related to lease agreements, emergency pet transport, and how to break lease safely in Texas. Her tabs reflected someone quietly navigating change. Not someone in fear, but someone in transition. SAPD's Behavioral Threat Assessment Team noted that her digital trail matched patterns of low-disclosure separation behavior, common among individuals attempting to exit unstable relationships without confrontation. There were no restraining orders filed, no calls to police, no allegations made publicly or within HR channels. But internally, her steps were coordinated, a sign that she understood risk, even if she hadn't reported it. Her veterinarian provided key corroboration. A scheduled visit for February 1st had been confirmed for her senior Labrador. The appointment was categorized as travel prep, interstate vaccine. That note signaled clear intention. She wasn't just moving locally. She was preparing for relocation that required pet clearance documentation. The dog's rabies certificate was reissued on January 20th, valid for interstate travel. From a procedural standpoint, this changed the investigative lens. Sheila-Jo wasn't passively involved in a difficult home life. She was executing an exit strategy, quietly, carefully, and for some reason, she never completed it. SAPD followed up with Ridge Hollow Apartments. A leasing agent confirmed that Sheila-Jo was scheduled to sign paperwork on February 2nd. The appointment had been made in person, and according to office notes, she had requested a ground floor unit with nearby access to an outdoor pet relief area. That attention to detail reinforced a consistent theme: control, safety, and a plan that included her dogs. Meanwhile, the forensic lab confirmed there were no animal hair or fur fibers found on the handgun. This became relevant when considering the apartment layout. If the dogs had been agitated during the shooting, they likely would have transferred trace material. But the dogs, by all accounts, were in the bedroom at the time of the incident. They were found there unharmed when officers entered. This detail mattered. It implied the dogs had been secured or were conditioned to stay out of conflict zones. Either way, it added a behavioral layer to what might have happened in the moments before the fatal shot. The SAPD forensic team conducted secondary scene analysis on February 3rd. Under ultraviolet light, trace residue of cleaning solvent was identified near the kitchen sink. Not unusual in a lived-in space, but noteworthy because a cloth soaked in a similar solvent had been discarded behind the washer unit. The cloth tested positive for both cleaning agent and trace levels of gun oil. No fingerprints were recovered from the cloth, but DNA analysis was pending. While not conclusively incriminating, the presence of that cloth and its location suggested post-incident activity inconsistent with the immediate panic described by the only witness present. The official statement from that witness remained under review, particularly regarding the timeline of events between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Interviews with Sheila-Jo's co-workers revealed a woman perceived as reserved but reliable. She showed up early, left on time, and avoided personal discussions. One colleague said, "She was quiet, but you could tell she was holding something in. Never dramatic, just careful." Another co-worker, Lindy G., said Sheila had confided vague concerns weeks prior. She mentioned needing a fresh start. "I thought it was just burnout, but maybe it was more." There was one final item worth noting. In her car, a 2012 silver Toyota Corolla parked in the designated spot outside the apartment, officers recovered a sealed envelope addressed to "whoever finds this," inside a typed list. It wasn't a suicide note, it wasn't a journal, it was a checklist: vet papers, lease docs, copy of key for new place emergency numbers, dog's microchip records, call mom after move. 2 items remained unchecked. The tone was neutral, clinical, another sign of someone managing a transition, not orchestrating a final exit. The case file grew thicker. The scene wasn't just about a fatal gunshot. It was about interruption, the end of a plan set in motion, one that had almost reached completion. From the moment Carlos Portillo was detained, his version of events carried inconsistencies. But it wasn't until SAPD's investigative team began comparing his verbal statements to digital and physical evidence that a deeper fracture emerged, one not just of memory but intent. On record, Carlos had initially claimed he had been asleep when Sheila-Jo was shot. He said he woke up to find her already unresponsive and in shock began yelling for help. He stated that he had never touched the weapon and had no idea what had happened. He blamed the drugs, the panic, and insisted, "I didn't even hear the shot." But his biometric data said otherwise. On February 4th, 2024, SAPD's Digital Forensics Unit completed the examination of Carlos's smartphone. Activity logs showed the phone was unlocked at 3:47 a.m., a full 2.5 hours before 911 was called. The screen remained active for approximately 6 minutes, long enough to open and close multiple apps. There was no emergency call placed, no contact with anyone, just silence, and then a return to standby. This contradicted his earlier claim that he had been asleep all night. Investigators reviewed motion sensor data from the apartment's smart thermostat, which captured ambient movement. The system registered active motion in the hallway and kitchen between 3:30 a.m. and 4:09 a.m., including temperature spikes consistent with someone walking repeatedly between rooms. The dogs, according to later interviews with animal control personnel, were calm when found. That detail aligned with the assumption that the dogs had not been startled by a violent act, but instead had already been secured or conditioned to remain passive. Carlos's statement about the gun also changed. Initially, he claimed no interaction. Later, under re-interview, he admitted to having touched the weapon, but only after discovering Sheila-Jo's body. However, the latent print on the trigger was clear, and the pressure ring around it indicated a firm grip. There was no evidence suggesting he had moved the firearm delicately or after the shot. Gunshot residue testing from Chapter 3 had already revealed a high concentration of lead, antimony, and barium on Carlos's dominant hand. But in this phase of the case, the forensic team also re-examined the lower hem of the shirt he was wearing. Micro spatter consistent with close-range discharge was found along the fabric fold. The pattern was not visible to the naked eye and was only confirmed under chemical testing and light enhancement. It placed him within 1 to 3 feet of the discharge point. The next layer of contradiction came with his timeline. According to Carlos, he and Sheila-Jo had both gone to bed around midnight. However, phone data from Sheila-Jo's device showed her active on her calendar app until just after 10:30 p.m. Then silence. Meanwhile, Carlos's phone remained inactive until it reawakened at 3:47 a.m., an activation that left a gap of roughly 5 hours unexplained. During interrogation, Carlos failed to account for this window. When asked directly, he shifted to vaguer phrases. "I must have been in and out. I don't remember much." The prosecutors didn't buy it. Neither did the lead investigator. More than gaps in memory, what emerged were clear lines of avoidance. Carlos's narrative adjusted in real time as new information was brought forward. It followed the evidence instead of preceding it. Investigators noted that his behavior during post-incident processing also raised questions. His clothing showed no attempts at concealment, but he had washed his hands multiple times prior to police arrival. The soap bottle in the bathroom was partially used. Time-stamped photo documentation suggested it had been moved between officer entry and full-scene lockdown. This mattered, not because it proved intent to kill, but because it challenged the authenticity of panic. Panic leaves chaos. This scene was surprisingly controlled. From a forensic standpoint, investigators were beginning to form a hypothesis, not of a planned execution, but of a confrontation that escalated, followed by efforts to downplay, adjust, and shift blame. Prosecutors would later term it post-incident narrative manipulation. Still, the physical evidence wasn't enough on its own to close the case. Motive had to be established. So the next step, already in motion, was to dig deeper into patterns of behavior, financial control, and whether there had been escalating emotional abuse beneath the surface. Because as it stood, the story Carlos told didn't just fail to answer key questions. It unraveled further with every forensic test. By mid-February 2024, forensic investigators had compiled enough physical evidence to construct a ballistic narrative, a critical phase in determining not just how Sheila-Jo Hanks Portillo died, but whether her death could have occurred in any other way than intentional homicide. The autopsy, conducted on February 1st, confirmed a single gunshot wound to the left temple. The projectile entered at a downward angle of approximately 14 degrees, passed through the cranial cavity, and lodged in the right occipital bone. No exit wound. The bullet was recovered intact and matched via rifling pattern to the 9mm Taurus handgun recovered at the scene. Trajectory analysis ruled out self-infliction. The angle of entry and bullet path suggested a shooter standing while the victim was seated or crouched. There were no defensive injuries on Sheila-Jo's hands. No bruising, no signs of recent struggle. Toxicology came back clean. No alcohol, no sedatives, no narcotics in her system. She had been sober, awake, and alert at the time of death. Investigators brought in a trajectory expert from the Bezard County Sheriff's Office. Using string mapping and trajectory rods, the team recreated the shot angle within the living room. The alignment passed directly through a seated target position on the left end of the sofa. The shooter's standing position, estimated from height, distance, and angle, placed the muzzle between 24 to 36 inches from the entry point. Close range but not contact. Gunshot residue on Sheila-Jo's body was minimal, only trace particles detected on her left cheek. There was no stippling or powder tattooing, further confirming a non-contact shot. This detail undermined any potential claim of suicide. Most self-inflicted gunshot wounds at the temple show either direct contact or near-contact patterns. The absence of soot or stippling aligned with an external shooter standing at moderate distance. Carlos Portillo's prints were recovered on the grip and trigger of the firearm. His DNA was found on the underside of the magazine. None of Sheila-Jo's prints appeared on the weapon. SAPD's firearms examiner concluded that the weapon had been handled without gloves shortly before discharge. Oil transfer from the shooter's skin was still present on the trigger guard. Scene photographs taken during the initial response had been enhanced digitally for further examination. Officers noticed that the throw pillow on the left end of the couch was missing from its usual location, as seen in earlier photos from Sheila-Jo's phone. That pillow was later found inside the bedroom closet, with a smear of dried blood near its seam. Blood confirmed to belong to the victim. Analysts posited that the pillow may have been used as an improvised silencer or barrier. Testing on the pillow revealed a faint concentric powder burn consistent with a discharge event. If true, it meant the shot had likely been muffled, intentionally. On February 12th, SAPD submitted the final firearm function test report. The 9mm Taurus was in normal working condition, no mechanical defects. Trigger pull weight within manufacturer standard. Safety features fully operational. The weapon did not discharge accidentally. Carlos Portillo's previous assertion that he had picked up the gun after the shooting was re-examined in light of these findings. SAPD noted that had the weapon fired during movement or handling, spatter patterns would show high-velocity blood traces along the floor or nearby vertical surfaces. None were found. Instead, the primary spatter was tight, directional, and limited to the head of the victim and adjacent sofa frame, evidence of a singular, controlled shot. Further, the pressure pattern on Sheila-Jo's scalp was consistent with immediate incapacitation. According to the forensic pathologist, death was nearly instantaneous. No time to react, no time to cry out. The evidence told a coherent story. Sheila-Jo had been shot at close range, without warning, from a standing position. She had no drugs or alcohol in her system. The shooter had handled the weapon without gloves, left biological evidence behind, and had likely taken steps to muffle the shot. The scene had not been chaotic, it had been deliberate. This phase of the investigation also included witness consultation from a firearms instructor familiar with the Taurus platform. The instructor confirmed that accidental discharge would require a specific, significant trigger pull, unlikely to occur during passive handling, especially unlikely without the trigger finger being placed firmly in the guard. Combined with Carlos's inconsistent timeline, the smart home motion data, and his GSR positive right hand, the forensic evidence constructed a chain that pointed directly at him, not just as a witness, but as the actor. The case file now supported a prosecutorial strategy. Prosecutors framed the incident as homicide in the context of escalating domestic control, rather than premeditated murder. The absence of a second shot, lack of visible planning artifacts, and no preceding threats placed it in a legal category where motive mattered. But evidence of the act mattered more. In interviews with detectives, Carlos showed no outward remorse. He denied the forensic conclusions, called the evidence wrong, and insisted the shooting must have happened when she dropped it or something. The forensic evidence didn't agree. Cases are rarely built on one discovery. They build slowly, piece by piece, until what's left is not interpretation, but structure. And in this case, the structure was holding up under scrutiny. By early June 2025, with forensic conclusions finalized, witness interviews closed, and the timeline fully mapped, the case against Carlos Portillo was trial-ready. Prosecutors had assembled a strong evidentiary record: ballistics modeling, DNA on the firearm, a single downward-angled shot with no defensive wounds, and a victim who had quietly been preparing to leave. The state didn't need a confession to win in court, but they preferred one. Trials are public, unpredictable, and emotional. A conviction was likely, but a plea would end it faster, cleaner, and with certainty. On June 6, 2025, the Bexar County District Attorney's Office extended a final offer: 45 years in prison for murder, to be served concurrently with 15 years on the separate methamphetamine possession charge. No eligibility for parole before year 25. No trial, no cross-examinations, no public airing of the victim's final hours. It was a strategic move. The prosecution believed the physical evidence would speak for itself, but knew that jurors can be unpredictable in domestic homicide cases, especially when the defense leans into emotional volatility or claims of accidental discharge. The plea offer was calculated to prevent any attempt to reframe the facts as an accident or lapse in mental clarity. Carlos accepted the deal on June 12th. During the formal plea hearing, he answered questions from the court without hesitation. He acknowledged understanding the charges. He confirmed he was not coerced. When asked directly if he was pleading guilty to the killing of Sheila-Jo Hanks Portillo, he replied yes. No elaboration, no justification. The record reflected a factual admission, nothing more. Sheila-Jo's family did not speak at sentencing. They had declined media interviews and were not present in court. The victim impact statement, filed in writing, was short and specific. It requested that justice be applied without spectacle. The prosecutor respected that request. In his final remarks before accepting the plea, the judge made only one public observation: that the evidence presented by law enforcement painted a clear and unbroken picture of culpability. He thanked the forensic analysts, the patrol officers who preserved the scene, and the behavioral specialists who guided the state's understanding of the relationship dynamics. With the plea entered and sentence imposed, Carlos was remanded into state custody and transferred to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He would not be eligible for parole review until 2050. Internally, SAPD closed the case with the file designation "solved by plea." The lead investigator noted in the report that no appeal was expected and that no reasonable doubt remains. Though the courtroom remained quiet, the resolution carried broader implications. The case highlighted what many investigators already knew, but often couldn't prove in time: that coercive control leaves few fingerprints, that some victims never call the police, and that safety planning, no matter how carefully executed, can still be interrupted by proximity and power. The forensic foundation of this case had been airtight, but the reason that mattered wasn't just for legal closure. It was for ensuring that Sheila-Jo's silence wouldn't be used against her. The evidence told the truth she never got to say out loud. There was no public press conference, no podiums, but law enforcement circulated a short internal training brief on the case, used to instruct officers on subtle indicators of domestic risk: last-minute financial changes, sudden calendar edits, pet relocation, and digital silence. Small moves that often precede attempted escape. In quiet cases like this, those details are the only signals investigators may ever get. The final chapter of the Sheila-Jo case did not unfold in a courtroom spectacle or a dramatic outburst. Instead, it closed as methodically and deliberately as it had begun, through forensic detail, procedural determination, and a quiet resolve that justice must still mean something, even when the victim's voice has been silenced. By early spring 2024, with the plea deal entered and the body formally identified through DNA and dental records, the focus of the investigation shifted from prosecution to closure. Not closure in the emotional sense. There was little comfort in knowing the truth, but in a legal and procedural sense. A criminal case, even one born from a lie as audacious as a missing person story maintained for 2 years, must be brought to its final conclusion. The two dogs, Tinkerbell and Foxy, had long been a background detail in reports, but law enforcement and volunteers did not forget them. On record, they were recovered property, evidence technically, but their journey revealed something more about the human side of tragedy. Transported over 2,100 miles across multiple states, the dogs were carefully handed off between rescue groups, coordinated by an interstate coalition of animal welfare organizations. The goal? To get them to a facility where they could live out their lives safely without further trauma or exploitation. The operation was not for publicity, no news crews followed the vans, but those who watched them arrive knew exactly why it mattered. In a case where cruelty had been so thoroughly normalized, even among neighbors who claimed to suspect nothing, saving what could be saved became an act of resistance. The dogs were not symbols. They were witnesses, silent, perhaps permanently traumatized, but living proof of what was endured. Behavioral specialists noted signs of severe confinement and psychological stress. They didn't need to testify in court. Their condition testified for them. Back in Johnson County, Arkansas, the investigation officially closed. The department filed final case summaries with digital evidence logs spanning more than 4 terabytes. Included were time-stamped photos, GPS data from Sheila-Jo's old phone, bank withdrawals under false pretenses, and interview transcripts, some chilling in their calm delivery of denial. District Attorney Jeff Phillips confirmed that although the plea agreement removed the necessity of trial, the findings would remain part of the public record. This office believes that the truth should remain accessible, he said during a brief press briefing. Not for spectacle, but so it doesn't happen again. He didn't name the defendant publicly. That decision, deliberate, matched a growing national trend in prosecutorial philosophy, refusing to sensationalize those responsible for intimate partner homicide, especially in cases where long-term psychological coercion is at play. Instead, he highlighted the forensic breakthroughs, the persistence of investigators, and the civilian tip that first drew their attention to inconsistencies in the original missing persons report. What began as a disappearance, one more woman vanishing into the statistical fog, ended not with applause but with a digital footprint, a found skull, a woman remembered by dental x-rays, and the route of 2 dogs crossing state lines. There's no formula for justice in domestic violence cases. Many unfold quietly, beneath the thresholds of law, until they become fatal. What this case demonstrates is that evil doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers instructions through years of isolation, control, and subtle humiliation. Sheila-Jo's story is not defined by the violence that ended her life. It is defined by the systems, neighbors, officers, data analysts who refused to walk away once the deception cracked. It's defined by the autopsy that spoke for her when no one else could, by the forensic odontologist who spent hours reconstructing her dental chart from decades-old records, by the volunteer who drove the final 400 miles to deliver her dogs to a sanctuary. No court ruling can reverse what happened, but the truth held together by documentation, not drama, becomes a bulwark, a deterrent, a record. In her final autopsy entry, beneath the clinical notations of injury patterns and bone trauma, one line stood alone in the examiner's remarks. Remains identified as female, approximately 45-55 years of age. Estimated date of death, early March 2022. No indication of medical intervention at time of death. Likely homicide. Identity confirmed. Sheila-Jo White. It was brief, unemotional, exact. But in that clarity was respect. It called her by name. And sometimes, in cases like this, that's the closest thing to justice a person can receive. What happened to Sheila-Jo was more than a crime. It was a failure of silence, of missed warnings, of trust betrayed over years. If there's one thing I've learned from following this case, it's that real evil often hides behind everyday smiles, and real courage is sometimes just asking the hard questions. If you feel something isn't right, say something. Your voice may be the one thing that saves a life. If this story moved you or made you think, I'd love to hear where you're watching from, or what part of this case stuck with you most. And if it didn't sit right, tell me why. Let's talk about it. If you're new here, Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Every case has something to teach us, and together, we can keep learning.